Dzień dobry moi drodzy. Jak widzicie, jestem w moim studiu zdalnym operowania światem, a to dlatego, że mój gość nie mógł tu być, bo jest aktualnie w Londynie. Nazywa się Chris Wylie i właśnie wyszła jego książka Mindfuck, Cambridge Analytica, czyli jak popsuć demokrację. To jest polskie tłumaczenie jego książki. Chris Wylie to jest osoba, którą możecie kojarzyć, jak to 2 lata temu był whistleblowerem, sygnalistą, mówiąc po polsku, który ujawnił skandal związany z firmą Cambridge Analytica, która miała to wpływać na Brexit, na referendum związane z Brexitem, na wybory prezydenckie w Stanach Zjednoczonych. I z nim rozmawiam o kilku ciekawych tematach. O tym, czy polskie wybory prezydenckie mogłyby być przekręcone przez taką firmę jak Cambridge Analytica. Dlaczego twój wujek, twój kuzyn, twój młodszy brat szukają teorii spiskowych na facebookowych grupach i dlaczego tak się dzieje, że te teorie spiskowe rozsiewane przez portale takie jak Facebook, czy wspomagane ich rozsiewaniem przez portale takie jak Facebook po prostu działa. Rozmawiamy o tym, co można zrobić, jak szukać rzetelnych informacji. Rozmawiamy o tym, czy i dlaczego powinniśmy się przejmować, każda pojedyncza osoba powinna się przejmować swoim profilem, który jest cały czas tworzony w sieci. A, jeszcze jedna rzecz. Chciałem tylko dodać, że założyłem kanał z najlepszymi fragmentami z rozmów, które są na tym kanale, czyli Imponderabilia. Są to wycinki, które robię. Kanał nazywa się Imponderabilia Clips. Możecie znaleźć link do niego w opisie tego odcinka. Dajcie mu suba, jeżeli chcecie na przykład dowiedzieć się, co tam ciekawego się wydarzyło w rozmowie, a nie macie już na starcie tej godziny czy 2, żeby przesłuchać całości. Tam będziecie mogli sobie wejść, zobaczyć, o, to jest ciekawe i stwierdzić, okej, dobra, teraz już wiem, że mam ochotę obejrzeć całość i tam właśnie te fragmenty krótsze są publikowane. Także zachęcam do subskrybowania Imponderabilia Clips. Ja teraz już nie przedłużając, moja rozmowa z Chrisem Wyliem. I would like to start with one hypothesis just for now, because maybe you've heard that we had a presidential election in Poland just a couple of months ago. And it's done. There was many problems during the COVID-19 outbreak, many ways of doing or trying to do properly this election, but it's over. And for now, after the second round, Mr. Andrzej Duda won with Rafał Trzaskowski with the result 51.03% for Mr. Duda to 48.97% for Mr. Trzaskowski. So it's just a little more than 400,000 valid votes. And I was wondering, how much effort would it take to change the result, hypothetically? And could you elaborate on that, if you remember all the gear you could use back when you were working for Cambridge Analytica?
Yeah, so I think what's important to sort of understand, which is, I think, what you were getting at about elections, is they are zero-sum games. So, unlike when two companies are competing, and where, if one company expands their market share by 2%, they get 2% more revenue. In an election, if you get 1%, 2% more than your opponent, you win 100%.
Exactly.
You become president, you become a member of Congress, you become a member of parliament.
You have it all.
And what's really critical, in that situation, is that very small numbers of people can have very profound impacts on the outcome of that event. And so when you look at the case of Cambridge Analytica, when it was set up, it was originally looking for finding that extra 1%, 2%, 3% of people who otherwise would not be engaging, in that election. And so, is it possible to alter the course of an election? Yeah, completely. And the suite of tools that Cambridge Analytica ended up developing were essentially profiling algorithms that would help a campaign or an organization identify who actually would make up that extra 1 or 2%, and what are the things that would engage them the most in order to show up and actually participate.
And for a company which is not, or were not based in Poland, so the company has to learn about the market voters. how much data you would have to collect about the polls to actually find the correct group to target your ads or clips or apps, anything you used back then on Facebook?
So I guess it sort of depends. By polls, you mean people in Poland?
Yeah,
you don't
yeah,
mean,
of course, yeah.
Poland. Okay, sorry. I thought just to clarify there.
Of course, yeah. People of Poland. Yep.
The people of Poland.
Yes.
Polish people.
Yes.
You know, what the way sort of Cambridge Analytica worked, and actually how a lot of micro-targeting works more broadly in the political sphere, is you first create an underlying data set where you harvest as much data on individual people that you can possibly sort of get a hold of. And you'd be surprised at how oftentimes available personal data is about people. Every time you use a credit card, every time you sign up to a subscription, every time you use a social media account, you are producing volumes of data about yourself. And oftentimes that data can be packaged and then sold on or passed on, whether lawfully or not, to businesses that want to use that data to track you and follow you and oftentimes influence your decisions, whether that's in a consumer context with targeted advertising, or that's in a political context with targeted campaign messaging. Once you have an underlying data set, and in Cambridge Analytica's case, Facebook made it very simple to acquire that data set. It was as simple as building a relatively straightforward Facebook app that harvested not only the data of the people using the app, but also all of the data of the Facebook friends of those people. So it scaled really quickly. And from that, you would then build an algorithm that would then look for positive relationships between the underlying data that you've collected and the particular type of person that you're looking for. So in Cambridge Analytica's case, they were often looking for people who would be more prone to conspiratorial thinking, who are more neurotic, and who were more likely to engage in more radicalized thinking. How does Facebook data allow you to do that? When you think about all of the pieces of information that you put out on Facebook or other social platforms, you're giving lots of little tiny clues that sort of begin to paint a picture of who you are. If you think about data like pixels on a screen, one pixel doesn't, give you a portrait of a person, but if you put enough pixels together, you create a picture, a photo that looks like that person. And it may not be a perfect representation of that person, but it gets you close enough to giving you an idea of who that person is. When people, for example, go out on a date, what are the questions that you ask somebody, right? What kind of music do you like? What kind of shows do you do? Do you watch? What do you do as your job? Who do you hang out with on the weekends? What you're doing in that circumstance is asking questions that allow you to that allow you to create a sort of a picture of that person in your mind. And all of that data is available also on Facebook. So all the algorithm does is it interrogates that information and builds a picture of who this person may be. And if this person matches the profile that algorithm is looking for, they get moved into a classification or a category that then is used to target that person with advertising or in invitations to join groups. And once you sort of have that target universe of people, you can then actually go and specifically engage them with content that you already know is more likely to actually motivate them to do something.
All right, I'll be asking you about the Facebook groups in a moment, but something ridiculously way more basic is which social media platform you consider, for now, of course, as the worst.
Oh, Facebook. I mean,
still.
Hands down.
How about Instagram?
Because so which is actually owned by Facebook. Yeah. So, sort of one on the same.
So you consider them as the same?
Well,
basically?
This is Facebook's position. So when I reported Facebook to the FBI and to British authorities, during my whistleblowing, the first action that Facebook took was to ban me off of the platform, and not just ban me off of Facebook, but also ban me off of Instagram because they own Instagram.
Yeah.
The reason why I say Facebook is sort of the I think the bottom of the barrel in terms of ethics for a tech platform is because they not only have the greatest amount of influence on public discourse in the world at the moment, but they also have like a huge number of instances where they have either behaved incredibly recklessly or in ways that have caused like grievous amounts of harm to people. So, for example, when you look at what happened in Myanmar, where the Burmese military used Facebook's platform to incite racial hatred to the point where tens of thousands of people were murdered on the back of a deliberate and constant campaign of hate organized by a military operation that utilized at the core of it Facebook to deliver that messaging, where the United Nations, this is not me saying this is the UN saying, that played a contributing role to ethnic cleansing. So you've got a platform that literally has an example of where it was weaponized to the point that tens of thousands of people were murdered. When you look at Facebook's role, for example, in misinformation about COVID, in particular in the United States, you've got all kinds of documented, very well documented cases of people who have been shown repeated amounts of misinformation about COVID conspiracies to the point where they take actions that put their health and the health of others at risk. And there are documented cases where that not only puts their health at risk, but has resulted in actual death. And, when you look at the problem of, the pandemic in certain parts of the world, like the United States, a large part of the difficulty in reining in the virus has been the, sheer amount of misinformation that people have been exposed to, which has caused an actual literal public health problem. And so in that circumstance, what may seem abstract or may seem, intangible because it just is online actually does have very real and tangible consequences where people can actually be harmed. And so, if you're in the situation of Facebook, you have the power to stop these things from happening. And Facebook is actively taking decisions to shirk their responsibility to protecting their users and protecting the communities that allow them to become a profitable company.
And let's change the scale, because you were talking about the countries, large groups of people who were switched to not believe that, for example, COVID-19 is something real. I was thinking about the way smaller scale, like one person or family. And I was thinking then that I'm a YouTuber, I'm a content creator. I use internet constantly. And still, I'm not, super tech savvy. I don't code, right? I don't know algorithms. I don't know how to build an app. And all of what you're saying is very interesting as a narrative, in some way, action movie, right? And what happened to you, what you did, but how to actually explain to one that your data, not like group, country, something large, but your data is important, and your data could be bought or could be stolen. How to explain this in the simple terms, in the simple English, because you can walk the street and you can say you should just delete Facebook to people and they won't do it, right? But if they would understand what it means to use Facebook in a like unleashed way, you use it all the time, you post anything, they would maybe change it. But I think that still is a great problem.
So, the question that I ask is, would you go on a date with a stalker? So,
all right. Yeah.
Would you feel comfortable going on a blind date?
Yeah.
Where the person sitting across from you knows absolutely everything about you and you know nothing about that? where the reason they know everything about you is because they've listened to all of your phone calls. They've looked through all of your photos that you've ever taken. They've created lists of all of the friends that you have, and indeed has looked at what your friends do as well, have followed you to work, have looked at what you do for your job, and knows a huge amount of, very intimate detail about who you are as a person. And you know absolutely nothing about that person sitting across from you. Would that be a comfortable situation? Most people would probably be uncomfortable with that, because when you have such an imbalance of information, what you call an information asymmetry, that also creates an imbalance in power. Because what that information allows that stalker to do is identify exactly how they should speak to you to get you to believe something, or for you to drop your defenses and open up and become vulnerable. And when you look at, instances of, grooming, or instances of fraud or elder abuse, very similar patterns happen. People learn enough about that other person to figure out what makes them vulnerable, and then tries to exploit that vulnerability. And so information in that sense can be very powerful. And, just because something happens online doesn't make it any less real than if you're sitting, face to face with a person. Because how many times a day do you look at your phone? How many times a day do you use a computer, or look at a television, or use an app? What would you do if you lost your phone? What would you do if you couldn't log into your social media accounts? What would you do if you couldn't use Google for a day, right? All of a sudden, your life starts to become quite difficult.
Wouldn't you just use Bing?
And that's actually how much, your life is mediated by tech platforms. So, I think people need to sort of take a step back and go, there is power in information, and everybody can be vulnerable. Everybody has unique flaws or traits or whatever that can turn them into a vulnerable target. And the most insidious thing about propaganda is that everybody who is a target of propaganda enjoys what they're seeing. You get targeted with propaganda because you're the type of person that probably would respond well to it. And so what's so insidious about, propaganda online is that people who start engaging with it don't necessarily have a problem with what they're seeing, because it reinforces a preconceived bias that they already have. But that bias can turn into manipulation, and that manipulation can turn into deception, where the more you start to engage with a particular type of content, the more extreme that content can become, and the more warped your perception can become. And this happens over time, so you don't even notice. And so this is why propaganda online is actually such a difficult sort of subject to deal with, because oftentimes people enjoy what they're seeing, and that's why they're clicking on it.
Sure. I was when you were saying, I said that if you couldn't use Google, you would just use Bing, but you didn't say anything, so it's probably not a problem using Bing. But about the data, almost no one can experience such thing as David Carroll had just recently, that he could, by the reporter of Channel 4, the British television, he was shown his file pulled off from Cambridge Analytica with his profile. I think it was put in Excel. I think Microsoft Excel. It's like a little tabs with data.
Yeah.
And his reaction was real. It was genuine. He was really shocked just by looking at his scores, from his moods to his charity donations to using other apps and stuff. And so I think that if everyone could just for a minute look into his pretty small, because it's a small file, right? It's TXT file probably, or something like that.
Yeah.
Then this would be the epiphany. That would be the moment. Like, oh my God, that's too much.
Anybody who lives in Europe is actually legally entitled to that information. So you can go onto Facebook and request the information that Facebook holds on you. And you will get a very large amount of information to the point of, including things like, maps that have tracked like where you've logged in, that has mapped out your commute to work, to all the lists of the people that you text on your phone and all the contacts of people on your phone. I think that people, in particular in Eastern Europe, who within living memory have gone through an experience of what happens when, you do have, in this case, governments keeping records on everyone. When you look at authoritarian regimes, one of the first acts of an authoritarian regime is to try to A, control and dominate as much media as possible, and then B, try to collect as much information on the population as possible. And these are two fundamental commonalities that pretty much every authoritarian regime in modern history undertakes. Whether it's in the Soviet Union or other countries in Eastern Europe, or whether it was Nazi Germany or wherever in the world you're looking at, control of information and collection of information is the basis of the maintenance of an authoritarian regime. And just imagine, how different, Poland's history could be if the Soviet Union had access to a tool like Facebook, right? Or if Nazi Germany had access to a tool like Facebook. The entire history of Eastern Europe could be fundamentally different. And if you find the idea of Facebook in Nazi Germany or Facebook in the Soviet Union slightly disturbing, you should be disturbed not simply by that hypothetical situation. You should be disturbed by the power of that tool, because right now we are just blindly trusting that Mark Zuckerberg and this company will make decisions that affect us in considering what is in our best interests. And I really think that it's problematic to give that amount of discretion and power to an American billionaire. I just that without any sort of legal control, or regulation or oversight. I think it poses a threat to the integrity of a democratic process.
And according to what you just said, I read or I heard very interesting thing you said, that when you have misinformed society in a country like UK, USA, or Poland, then you can actually think about these countries as some African poor countries who are being misinformed and manipulated for years now. And then in the result, there is no bigger difference between the UK or US allegedly rigged election or rigged some kind of system than in some African country.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to point out in the book is that there are some sort of I think problematic assumptions about Western countries that if you are from America or Britain or somewhere in Europe, that somehow your country is more stable and your population is less susceptible to propaganda and to deception and to interference in your elections. When we talk about the problems in America, we use different language. We don't talk about tribal conflict. We don't talk about regimes. We don't talk about religious violence, right? Or ethnic tension. We don't use but that is what we're seeing right now in the United States. We are seeing religious extremism. We are seeing ethnic tension. We are seeing an autocratic regime that is conducting itself in ways that violate human rights, putting children in cages on the Mexican border. We don't use the language that we would were we to describe the same situation in a developing country, in Africa, for example. And so something that I point out is that, as humans, there are fundamental factors in how we interact and behave with one another, and also fundamental vulnerabilities that we have. And if we are not honest with ourselves about those vulnerabilities, we will blind ourselves to the, obvious reality if you actually just look at it without any kind of tinted lens. When you look at fairness in elections and the importance of electoral law, as much as it sounds like sort of an arcane topic that a law professor or whatever would sort of blather on about, it's actually really important. And when you look at the case of Brexit, where the Vote Leave campaign, through unlawful financing, committed one of the largest breaches of campaign finance law in British history, that funded a affiliate company of Cambridge Analytica to run what was also unlawful data targeting activities. There is a question about whether or not the victory of Vote Leave is won on the basis of unlawful activity, and whether or not that would whether that calls into question the integrity of the result itself. And the thing that I learned in this sort of whole process is that we actually sort of weirdly treat cheating in the Olympics or cheating on a student's exam more seriously than we treat cheating in an election. When you look at the case of Brexit, there was clear cheating that happened. This was found by the Electoral Commission. And the people who were involved in that cheating got promoted into the Prime Minister's office. Some of whom are now sitting in the House of Lords. And if we, and the sort of overall debate about what happened in Britain was, oh, well, did it really matter? It was just some data. It was just some targeting, whatever. They spent lots of money that they shouldn't have, but the election is over. So let's just move on. But if you're caught doping in the Olympics, right? If you're an athlete and you just ran the triathlon and then you do your drug test, right, and you're caught doping, there isn't a debate about, oh, well, would you have won in the first place? How much did they dope? What did they really dope with? Did it really matter? Like, they've already won, they've already got their medals, so maybe we should just move on. No, You lose your medal and you get disqualified. The same thing happens if you're a student caught cheating, on your exam. You get a fail. You might get expelled. Except when it comes to our election, we tolerate cheating. And this is sort of one of the things also that I try to point out in the book, is that I think part of the reason, particularly in Britain, that there is this tolerance of cheating is because I think that people don't want to accept that even in a, rich and powerful country like Britain, British democracy is just as vulnerable as democracy in Nigeria or Kenya. And that sometimes you can have results that really should be called into question. But simply because you're a powerful country, a rich country, and you don't want to see yourself as another country like, Nigeria or Kenya, that sort of naive superiority blinds you from what is actually a reality of what's happening. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book was just to help people sort of take a look at that and go, yeah, maybe there is a point to this. Maybe like technology right now is being used to undermine our democracies.
Let's stop for a minute with the Brexit, because just recently, Information Commissioner's office said that there was no evidence that Cambridge Analytica did something wrong with the Brexit referendum. And I know that you have different approach to that. Yeah,
that's not sort of entirely true. That's how it sort of got reported. But actually what the report said is the legal entity, Cambridge Analytica. But when you look at, what is clear, not to get into the sort of corporate structuring of the sort of mess of international companies that collectively became sort of this cloud that we call Cambridge Analytica, it's equivalent of saying, if you take money from country A, set up a shell company in a Caribbean island and move it, and then that company keeps the money, it's like saying that there was no sort of wrongdoing here. There was no tax evasion because there was a differently named company that did something else somewhere else in the world. What actually happened in Brexit was the company that has a very clear contractual and proprietal relationship with Cambridge Analytica that actually built a lot of the fundamental software of Cambridge Analytica and operated as a subsidiary of Cambridge Analytica was the largest single expenditure of vote leave. It just had a different name. And so the only difference between Cambridge Analytica and AIQ, which was the company that ran the tech operations of vote leave, was the name. It shared the same office. It shared the same staff. It built the same technology. In all substantive, and factual senses, it was the same company. The only difference was that it had a different name. And if our standards are so low that we will turn a blind eye to cheating simply because a company sets up a different subsidiary with a different name, and that's enough to cheat in an election, well, I think that we have like a real problem. Imagine if we accepted that for tax evasion. Imagine if we accepted that in the global financial system, that as long as you just set up a different company name and you move money into that company, there's no more problem. Yeah. Right? It would be absurd. And this is actually really where, we see the limitations of the law when it comes to handling technology, because the law right now does not, properly account for the international nature of tech platforms in the internet. And we had the same kind of problem with tax avoidance and tax evasion in the 60s and 70s, where at one point in time, it was a simple, if you didn't want to pay your taxes, set up a fake company in a Caribbean island, move all your money there, and that's all you needed to do. But the laws in a lot of countries caught on to that reality and created new legal tests and new legal standards, economic substance tests, where it's no longer sufficient to simply just move some money to a differently named company. But right now, with data, it is. You can launder data from one country to another in the same way that you used to be able to launder money from one bank account to another. And something that highlights a real problem is the report that came out from the ICO, in that they were technically correct that Cambridge Analytica was not the primary service provider, but its subsidiary was.
Yeah.
But that was sufficient to avoid liability.
Let's go back to more simple things. What is your hygiene with the technology? What do you recommend not to use apart from Facebook? Do you have some sort of blacklist of devices, apps, sites which you recommend not to use?
Ironically, Zoom is one of them.
I know. Yeah.
But I don't use Zoom for private conversations. But
this one will be public, so
will be posted. Fine. Everybody will be able to see it. So including Zoom.
Sure.
The thing I give, if when people ask me about privacy tips, the first thing I say is get a VPN, which is a virtual private network. You don't even need to know what it is. Yeah. It's just a thing that makes it more difficult for whether it's government or internet service providers to track what you're doing online. There are free ones. There are also some very good ones that are fairly inexpensive, like NordVPN.
Yeah.
And also for text messaging, I use Signal. I don't use WhatsApp because it's owned by Facebook.
No, that is true. Yeah.
But I recommend Signal because it is very easy to use. You don't need to understand anything to do with encryption. It works just like WhatsApp would, but there's end-to-end encryption, which means that it's very difficult for your communication to be tracked, hacked, or otherwise exploited. But the thing that I would say is that more broadly, I don't think that it really should be the responsibility of people to actually feel like they need to protect themselves against an adversarial tech environment. For me, I actually find it really problematic that even people like I need to recommend using certain things, because that really shows the gaps in the law that companies can constantly track you, and they're entitled to. And even in Europe with the GDPR and all of that, because it's as simple as you clicking yes, I accept, and then it's GDPR compliant. Lawyers will probably get mad at me because there's lots of exceptions to that. There are broader issues that the law does not address, whether it's in Europe or in particular the United States. And the problem that I have with the question, like, what should I do to protect myself, is, if we actually shift our understanding to looking at these things not as free services. Facebook will describe itself as a free service. When Mark Zuckerberg, went and testified at the Senate, he used that term several times. We're a free service and people can choose to use us or not. I take real issue with that, because using the logic of Silicon Valley, anything can be described as a service. So the building that I'm sitting in or that you're sitting in, we could describe as a shelter as a service. And the lease and rent that you pay is a subscription package, right? And you subscribe to my shelter as a service. But it would be absurd to describe a building as a service, because it's an architecture, it's a construction. And there's a really important clue in that, because when you look at the job titles of people who work at Facebook or other big tech companies, it's not service relationship manager, it's architect or engineer. And the way a lot of these products are discussed and conceptualized internally inside of a company is an architecture. And we regulate architecture differently than we do regulate services, right? You do not have terms and conditions to a building. You do not have terms and conditions to the engineering of an airplane. You do not have terms and conditions to a bridge, right? There are preset standards that are technical safety standards and quality standards that have to be met for that product of engineering. And this is, I think, the biggest gap in both understanding in the general public in how we talk about this problem, but also in the law, because we regulate constructions, we regulate architectures as a service when we should be regulating it in the same way that we regulate a building, or any kind of sort of public planning exercise. Facebook, describes itself, as a community. I look at it as a gated community, right? It has a lot of problems that you see, that you've seen, historically with segregation, for whether it was in the United States or apartheid South Africa, or even the ghettos, the Jewish ghettos that you saw in Eastern Europe, during the war. That what you have right now is a deliberate design that takes people and puts them into different places where they no longer interact with one another. And when they no longer interact with one another, they no longer develop a really important shared experience that allows you to empathize with somebody who is different from you. And as soon as you create these ghettos online, these informational ghettos, or these sort of cognitive segregations, this is where you get this fractured political discourse that everybody is complaining about. And it's not about people, it's about the design. And I think one of the things that I try to do in the book, but also, when I go and talk to Congress or the European Commission or whatever, is really constantly bringing people back to, rather than talking about users, let's talk about the architects and designers of the system. Because the architects and designers of this system, which is segregating people, are the ones who have the knowledge and the know-how to understand what it is that they're creating, not users. And they also have the power and the money to fix the problem, not users. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is, not look at this like it's an individualized problem where it's the responsibility of ordinary people or users to protect themselves. We should be asking the question, why are these designs and architectures allowed in the first place? And why do we not have laws, in the same way that we have laws to protect people from unsafe buildings? Why do we not have laws to protect people from unsafe digital architecture?
And you saying about these places, obviously, first things that comes to mind is Facebook groups, which I think, especially now during the COVID-19 outbreak, these places are the worst possible places to gather information. Of course, there are groups with, selected, moderate pieces of information, but I think that many of those are just places that you go to be angry or to shout at Bill Gates, who wants to put the chips in all of us. And I think that there is nothing being done about the Facebook groups right now.
Yeah, and there's a reason. There's actually like a sort of fairly simple explanation as to why misinformation, disinformation spreads faster than factual information. And that's not me alleging this. There's actually research on this. Like disinformation spreads like 7 times faster than factual information online.
Okay.
And it's for a couple of reasons. First of all, factual information is often laden with context and background. And so it is cognitively more like effortful to understand than disinformation, where things can be explained in a really simple way. And secondly, that as humans, we have evolved to pay more attention to threats than anything else. So if you imagine, you're a primitive human 20,000 years ago and you're standing in a field, right? And there could be like the most beautiful sunrise that you've ever seen. But right next to you is a dead body. What are you going to pay attention to?
Yeah.
You can't take your eyes off of that dead body. And there's a reason for that. Because if you paid attention to the most beautiful sight that you've ever seen, the sunrise, and you ignored the dead body, the thing that killed that person might come and kill you. And so we are preconditioned to disproportionately pay attention to things that scare us or upset us or make us angry. Because way back when, that was protective. That was a beneficial trait for you surviving in nature, right? In the context of a modern society, and the context of the internet, that effect that used to be protective all of a sudden becomes really problematic, because you now have a set of information in front of you. One is non-threatening and contextual and more effortful to look at and engage with. The other is threatening and simple. So what do you think is going to spread faster?
Yeah.
It's the thing that's threatening and simple. And the real problem that you get is when you have recommendation algorithms that are designed to learn what are the things that are going to engage people the most, because this is a word that like tech companies love to use, engagement, right? And there's always sort of this implied, positive quality to engagement. Engagement is a metric that all these companies use to showcase why they have a good product. There's a lot of engagement. With drug addiction, there's a lot of engagement, right?
Yeah.
Alcoholism, there's a lot of engagement with the product. Engagement in itself doesn't mean that it's good. Engagement just means that it's like highly engaging. That's all it means. And so the problem with engagement-oriented algorithms for deciding what you see on your newsfeed is these algorithms learn quite quickly that content that is simple and threatening is the thing that's going to make you click more and also spend more time on that content. And so what you've created is an entire system that is designed to pick at an underlying precondition of like humanity, which is to pay attention to things that scare us and threaten us. And that's a real problem because that is faulty design. We should be accounting for these issues when we're designing digital products. So just because more people click on something doesn't mean that that's a positive thing. And with the COVID pandemic happening, we see this play out in a really tangible way, where people's health is put at risk by this false information. And this is not a free speech issue. Like this is about the design of a system that lubricates falsehoods to make it faster the faster spread of falsehoods. no one is saying that you are not entitled to believe whatever it is that you want. You can believe that vaccines are a conspiracy. You can believe that COVID's not real. You can believe whatever it is that you want. The aliens are all running the world. It's all lizards, right? Whatever you want to believe. But your right to believe and say what you think does not entitle you to an artificial amplification of those viewpoints, right? When I stand outside in the town square and I shout my conspiracy theory, right? My free speech is that I am not penalized or punished for that, right? It is not an entitlement for a company to give me a megaphone. Mm. And that is the biggest difference, is that Facebook and social media has become an artificial megaphone for falsehoods. And this is where I think the law really does need to step in and regulate the underlying design to make it more difficult for falsehoods to spread.
You're absolutely right. And I was thinking about the recent problems for LGBT community in Poland, because we have tons of problems, especially government has tons of problems with the LGBT people, and there are, LGBT free zones in Poland which are still actually existing, and I was connecting this madness with something I heard from one of the guys from Cambridge Analytica, from some hidden footage, when he said that there are two most important things you have to be looking at when you want to measure people. One is their hopes, and second is their fears. And I think that in some way that kind of outbreak of hatred against LGBT people is based on fear, which is artificially created by someone. And it's actually going from the digital world and going out to the offline world.
Well, the discourse that happens online does not stay online, right? Yeah. Where do you read the news each day, right? Where do you talk to your friends each day? It's most of it now is online. So there is no divide between digital and temporal anymore. They are a completely merged part of the reality that we live. And when it comes to stoking fear about whether it's ethnic minorities or LGBT people or whatever, political campaigns and authoritarian regimes and extremist groups and cults and whatever throughout history have always tried to find a group and demonize them. Right. And so, in Poland, like, it used to be Jews. Now it's gay people. Right. Like every moment in history has a group that another group tries to point at and blame all problems at. And the issue is when you have a system that is designed to amplify this threatening and hate-mongering information, right? And that causes real harm. If you are the victim of homophobia in a country like Poland, part of the blame rests on a company like Facebook for allowing that hate to spread like wildfire on its system. Real harm comes from this. This is not an intangible issue, right? We just have to understand that there is no longer a distinction between what happens online and what happens in the temporal physical space that we live in.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, you're a whistleblower, and what you did is it was an act of courage in some way. I think that 2 years ago you weren't so smiling all the time like now. I was wondering, did you contact, for example, someone like Edward Snowden, and did you ask him for an advice when you were doing the Cambridge Analytica outbreak?
So I had the benefit of using lawyers at the very beginning of my journey. So. Okay. the one thing that I tell people, if they're ever thinking about reporting a company, reporting a government, reporting wrongdoing, whistleblowing in some way, is talk to lawyers first. Because what lawyers help you do is understand where are the potential risks to you, and also what is the most lawful and appropriate way to disclose information that may be subject to an NDA or confidentiality agreement, or may be indeed sensitive government information or military information. And so in the case of Cambridge Analytica, you had a very sort of complicated situation where I was subject to confidentiality agreements that I had to break. I was also in possession of information that related to national security interests of the United States and the UK, which in itself has certain kinds of regulations and laws about it. And also information that would be broadly embarrassing to a lot of very powerful people in a lot of different places. Not just in the United States or the UK, but also, this is a company that collected, compromising information on politicians all around the world. And so that situation in itself was quite complicated from a legal standpoint, balancing all of these different interests and risks. But I had the benefit of talking to lawyers first. So when I had conversations with lawyers, it wasn't, I'd already done it. Let's figure out how to solve these problems. We had the benefit of planning out a process so that we would not accidentally break the law, or break the law in some kind of unjustifiable way where there'd be no defense to it. And some of the lawyers that I was able to speak to previously had worked on aspects of the Edward Snowden case, and they were familiar with some of the risks and pitfalls of that situation, which in hindsight could have been avoided. And so I guess in that sense, I learned through the experience and journey of other whistleblowers how to manage a complicated case of information in a way that you may not, where you can still protect yourself at the same time. And, but it was still, quite scary at times. The information simultaneously upset very powerful people in the White House, and also, in disclosing to U.S. authorities emails from, for example, the Russian embassy in London to affiliates of Cambridge Analytica, also simultaneously really upset the Russian government. And so it took quite an event to simultaneously enrage the American and Russian government at the same time about the same material. And in that position, in that situation, I was in a vulnerable situation. But I had the benefit of having a lot of support. When people sort of talk about whistleblowing, they often frame it as sort of this David versus Goliath, the little guy versus the big powerful thing. And, I was up against, very powerful entities, the American government, the Russian government, several billionaires. But I had a bunch of people helping me and supporting me and guiding me along the way. And so I think that was, a significant difference, and why it is that I'm in, a less vulnerable situation now than other whistleblowers have been in the past.
Great. I think that you did a great job by figuring out this first, not exposing first and then figuring out what to do next. That's awesome. But
that was the biggest difference.
Yeah.
It was the biggest difference.
Great.
And there, when you look at, for example, Edward Snowden, not to say, not to criticize what he did or call into question what he did, but there would have been ways of disclosing that information where he may not have ended up in the really difficult situation that he is in now.
Yeah.
Had he had the benefit of having a legal team supporting him at the beginning of that process rather than at the end of that process.
Sure. But on the other hand, do you miss it? Do you miss Cambridge Analytica? Because when I read what I read in your book, there are some descriptions of parties with Alexander Nix, which To me, that looked pretty awesome. So when you could, do it and not leave, not to have these thoughts that maybe you're not doing right thing by staying in Cambridge Analytica, how do you think about that now?
I don't miss Cambridge Analytica in that sense.
Right.
Just because there were rich people who could host really fancy parties, at the end of the day, if the reason, you're there at that party is because you're helping them undermine, democracy, or, instigating racism in society, it is, it's like justifying any kind of authoritarian regime because you got to go to a good party. It was in Soviet Union or, Nazi Germany or Franco Spain. I'm sure there were great parties there too. But, at the end of the day, that's on the backs of people who are being victimized. And, you can't sort of put yourself before that ultimate reality as to like why this company is existing. I will say that there was some pretty interesting and amazing people that I met at the company who were very smart and brilliant in their own ways. And the sort of total amounts of intellectual freedom that was afforded to a lot of people, I think, is rare in any company. The sort of free reign to just experiment and learn can be very appealing to people who are interested in that kind of research or that sort of area of exploration. The thing that I learned, though, is that when you follow, the mantra that Facebook really pushes, which is move fast and break things, just continue to learn and continue to experiment, continue to improve and develop that thing, that creation that you're working on. And if things break along the way, who cares? Just keep running at it. It really changes in a really problematic way how somebody looks at what they're doing. Because if you don't consider that you may be breaking society in the process, you may be harming people in the process, that may not be a good enough justification. That making something cool or exciting for your own intellectual purposes at the expense of somebody else is not justifiable. And so, one of the things that I learned both about myself, but I think something that a lot of data scientists and software engineers could relate to is, curiosity is a powerful thing for some people. And the excitement of creating something new is a very powerful motivator. But as engineers, as the sort of architects of technologies that touch people and affect them each day, we have a responsibility to think about the people who will be using that. And, are we doing right by them? And that they are as much of a stakeholder in your creation as you are. And the thing that I really learned is that there's a gap in software engineering that needs to be filled by ethics. When you look at other professions, physical or civil engineering or architecture or other, professions, whether it's nurses, teachers, doctors, lawyers, whatever, every other sort of profession has a standard code of ethics that you have to abide by in the course of your job. And if your employer asks you to do something that is manifestly unethical, you have a professional obligation to say no. And that's really missing in software engineering. And it's something actually that I write about at the end of the book, that, a lesson here is we need to not only teach people who work in technology to have a wider view of their creation, but also put some skin in the game and create requirements, including legal requirements to do so as well.
I was the question about the parties and do you miss it? It was on purpose because you said that you could not stay just because of that, and I totally understand. I agree, and I admire it. But you were the guy who did it, and many people would stay and it's not nothing. It's absolutely not nothing. So, for me, that's
I mean, a lot of people did
right.
stay, and a lot of people did stay because when you get paid a lot of money and you get to meet a lot of fancy people, that can there is an appealing aura about that for some people they may look the other way as to what they're doing. But when the consequences are electing a crazy man to the White House, or irrevocably changing the Constitution of the United Kingdom, and also breaking up the European Union, those are not minor things. That's not you're fiddling around the edges, or maybe not paying the right amount of tax or something, some small infraction of the law. Those are really big things that that should not be ignored. And so for me, there was sort of, it wasn't even a question of if. It's sort of, I just had to at the end of the day.
All right. One last question, because we were talking mostly about ourselves or governments, and I was thinking about maybe you could say something like call to action, what to say, how to teach, or what to teach our parents, people who are not as well trained in using technology, what we could say to our parents, because many of them are using Facebook groups, many of them are sharing their personal info on WhatsApp or on the Facebook Messenger. What to tell them to actually, make their lives more safe on the internet, of course.
So I actually get this question a lot,
All right.
and I don't have a good answer to it, because I think a lot of people can relate to having a relative, whether it's parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever, who at a family dinner brings up something that they saw on Facebook.
Of course.
They challenge it. Oftentimes you'll get into an argument, or there's just no hope. It's you can't convince this person just because some person shared something on Facebook doesn't mean it's true. And this is actually the problem, because getting back to the point that I was making earlier about individualizing the problem, it's not actually going to solve anything to go and call up your uncle who reads conspiracy theories on Facebook, because chances are he's still going to. And even if you talk him down from the latest conspiracy that he's seen on the group that he chats with, well, there'll be a new one next week. And this gets to a broader point that I try to make at the end of the book, which is that the reason your uncle is engaging with this material is because he is using the product of design and deliberate design of engineers in Silicon Valley. And that it should not be your responsibility to deal with the impact of bad design and bad architecture, in the same way that you would not be responsible for helping your uncle deal with an unsafe building, right? The responsibility lies with the architect. The responsibility lies with the engineer, the designer, the builder, the company that owns it. It's not the people who inhabit who have the responsibility to protect themselves. It's the people who make money and have the power and the knowledge and know-how to fix the problem. And so I'd say, the most sort of impactful thing that an individual can do is actually challenge the companies to do better, or challenge their politicians or their representatives to consider or enact laws that require these companies to do a better job at protecting users. Because it's a funny or an awkward situation with your uncle, but when you span that out to an entire population, and those conspiracies may be something related to a public health crisis, or ethnic violence where people can actually get hurt, it's no longer funny. It's no longer awkward. It actually becomes quite serious. And so I think, what can you do as an individual? Get upset about it. get angry about it and like tell these companies to, do their effing job.
All right, that's a great ending sentence. Thank you very much, Christopher. It was great talking with you. I wish you all the best.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.
Dziękuję, moi drodzy. To była rozmowa z Christopherem Wylim. Ja jeszcze tylko na koniec przypomnę, że najciekawsze fragmenty Imponderabiliów publikuję na kanale Imponderabilia Clips. Klik.